Number 1. The Vashka River Geoglyphs. Sometime in the early 1970s, Soviet military pilots flying aerial cartography missions over the Komi Republic photographed something they weren't looking for. Below them, carved into the terrain near the Vashka River, were enormous geometric patterns: lines, triangles, trapezoids, shapes that had no business being there. The Komi Republic covers roughly 415,900 square kilometers of boreal forest, swamp, and tundra. About 15% of the territory is wetland. It remains one of the most remote and least inhabited regions of European Russia. The nearest settlement of any real size, Lake Issyk-Kul, sat more than 150 kilometers from the formations. You could only reach the area by river or by winter roads. Ground-level archaeological survey was nearly impossible. The formations themselves resembled Peru's Nazca lines, but these were embedded in permafrost-era terrain at roughly 63 degrees north latitude, deep inside the Arctic taiga. Limited ground surveys conducted alongside the aerial work produced tentative dating to the Mesolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 BCE, based on soil stratification. That's a staggering age claim. The Komi region's historical population, the Finno-Ugrit Komi Syrians, arrived no earlier than the 3rd millennium BCE. If the dating held, the geoglyphs predated them by thousands of years. Nobody knew who built them. The geometric character set these markings apart from known petroglyph traditions. They weren't representational: no animals, no human figures. Purely geometric, linear, triangular, trapezoidal arrangements with no obvious parallel in the archaeological record of the subarctic. The Vashka River Basin's podzolic and tundra soils are hostile to organic preservation, which meant corroborating artifacts were extremely difficult to recover. Here's where the story breaks down. Soviet classification protocols filed the photographs as military cartographic material. They entered defense archives, not academic circulation. The institutional logic was straightforward. Military mapping teams produced military documents. Those documents went into military filing systems. Nobody at the Academy of Sciences ever saw them. The ideological dimension made things worse. Soviet frameworks had no mechanism for interpreting pre-Slavic, pre-Uralic monumental construction. Findings that implied advanced Mesolithic hunter-gatherer organization were awkward. They didn't fit the narrative. And in the Brezhnev era, the cost-benefit analysis of subarctic fieldwork made archaeological follow-up a low priority. The Komi Republic's value to Moscow lay in coal, oil, gas, diamonds, and timber. Extraction, not excavation. No formal archaeological expedition was ever dispatched. The photographs sat in classified archives. Post-Soviet researchers have not relocated the specific images, which may still exist in declassified military cartographic collections. No systematic search has been published. 3 theories compete. The mainstream position holds that the patterns are natural periglacial patterned ground produced by freeze-thaw cycles, but triangular and trapezoidal forms are atypical of known cryogenic processes. The archaeological theory proposes an unknown Mesolithic culture with the organizational capacity for monumental construction, paralleling Göbekli Tepe's demonstration that pre-agricultural societies could build monuments. The speculative view connects the geoglyphs to Scandinavian stone labyrinths and Solovetsky Islands megaliths, suggesting a lost circumpolar civilization. The Turgai geoglyphs found later in Kazakhstan via satellite imagery, confirmed as human-made and dating to approximately 8,000 years ago, prove that large-scale Mesolithic geoglyphs in Central Eurasia are not impossible. Modern satellite archaeology and LiDAR have not been systematically applied to the Vashka Basin. It remains one of the most promising unexplored targets in northern Eurasian archaeology. The story is almost entirely absent from English-language scholarship. But those aerial photographs didn't represent the only things the Soviets pulled out of classified archives and buried. Some of their most consequential discoveries came not from their own territory, but from the ruins of the Third Reich. Number 2. The Ahnenerbe Files and Operation Osoavia Kim. On October 22, 1946, in the early morning hours, MVD and Soviet Army units rounded up over 2,500 German scientists. They transported them by rail to the USSR, along with approximately 4,000 family members. The operation was called Osoavia Kim. It had been decreed on May 13, 1946, under Council of Ministers. Resolution number 1017-419. The objective was to transfer construction bureaus and 2,000 German specialists by year's end. Osoaviakum is remembered for rocketry and aviation. What's far less documented is the parallel effort. NKVD team systematically cataloged seized documents from the Ahnenerbe, the SS's pseudoscientific research division. Heinrich Himmler had established it on July 1st, 1935, as an SS appendage devoted to promoting racial theories through academics who fostered the idea of Aryan superiority. The seized materials covered research on Tibetan ritual practices, alleged Sumerian acoustic technologies, runic symbology, and Cathar religious artifacts. All of it filtered through Nazi racial pseudoscience. Ahnenerbe members had destroyed much of the organization's paperwork during the war's final days, but a member named Brucker, ordered to destroy 18 active research facilities, refused. Some facilities fell intact to the Red Army. The Soviets had zero interest in Aryan racial theory. What they wanted was exploitable intelligence on psychic phenomena, mind control, and unconventional weapons. According to Sergei Kernbach's 2013 review, Post-War Soviet 13 review, post-war Soviet unconventional research began with a study of Germany's Ahnenerbe archives. The Soviets termed their research psychotronics, built on the idea that the human brain could receive and transmit high-frequency electromagnetic radiation. The Marxist materialist constraint shaped everything. Any psychic phenomena had to be framed as natural physical processes rather than supernatural ones. Research spread across Special Department Number 8 in Siberia, the KGB, GRU Military Intelligence, and the Academy of Sciences. Researchers developed a device called a Kirpan, designed to generate and store high-frequency electromagnetic radiation, based partly on concepts derived from the seized German research. By 1967, according to a 1972 Defense Intelligence Agency report, the USSR had more than 20 centers studying paranormal phenomena with a combined budget of $21 million. 3 research branches emerged: classic parapsychological experiments, programs on electromagnetic radiation influence on biological objects, and what was called high-penetrating emission of non-biological nature. The total estimated cost of the psychotronic arms race reached as much as $1 billion. It ended only in the early 21st century. Both Americans, through Operation Paperclip and M-Cultra, and Soviets, through Osoaviakim and psychotronics, independently used captured German research as springboards for mind control programs. The mainstream view says the Ahnenerbe research was pseudoscientific nonsense, and the Soviets wasted $1 billion chasing phantoms. The historical interpretation notes that some declassified Soviet electromagnetic research on biological systems has been validated by modern neuroscience. The program may have produced legitimate findings that were buried under classification. The speculative position holds that some Ahnenerbe research encoded genuine ancient knowledge about consciousness manipulation or acoustic effects that both superpowers recognize as militarily valuable. Much of the seized material remains in Russian military and intelligence archives. Post-Soviet declassification has been minimal. Western scholarly access is near zero. The documentary chain is clear. The files exist. Their approximate location is known. Their contents remain classified. The Ahnenerbe files represented captured knowledge the Soviets tried to exploit. But some of the most valuable ancient knowledge they pursued wasn't seized from an enemy. It was sitting in their own museum storage, waiting to be read. Number 3, the Turfan manuscript operations. The most important Central Asian manuscript findings are the Manichaean texts unearthed in the Turfan Oasis. They are the first original remnants of an extinct world religion. Russian, German, and Japanese expeditions recovered them across the early 20th century. Turfan sits on the northern Silk Road in Xinjiang, China. Soviet scholars accessed the manuscript caves during early expeditions and again during Sino-Soviet cooperation in the 1950s. 4 major collections ended up scattered across empires. The Stein collection went to London, the Turfan collection to Berlin, the Pelliot collection to Paris, and the Oldenburg collection to St. Petersburg. Sergei Oldenburg led Russian expeditions in 1909 through 1910 and again in 1914 through 1915. His collection contains thousands of fragments that remain partially cataloged to this day. The Berlin collection holds the greatest number of Manichaean originals from Central Asia. It also contains unique Christian texts in Sogdian, Bactrian fragments in so-called Hephthalite script, and Old Turkish fragments. The linguistic diversity is extraordinary. Fragments exist in at least a dozen languages: Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, Bactrian, Tocharian, A and B, Old Turkish, Syriac, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and Uyghur. Thanks to these texts, 3 Middle Iranian languages became substantially known for the first time: Parthian, Sogdian, and Saka. The Sogdians were the master merchants of the Silk Road. Their language served as the lingua franca of Central Asian trade from roughly the 4th to the 10th century CE. The Sogdian, from ancient letters dating to around 313 to 314 CE, are the earliest known Sogdian documents. They revealed surprisingly sophisticated trade networks that made Soviet researchers suspect deeper archives existed with older material. Soviet ideological interest was clear, demonstrating that peoples of Soviet territory contributed to world civilization independently of Western narratives served state goals. The text delivered. Manichaean cosmological writings described astronomical observations, alchemical processes, and light physics theories that seemed anachronistically advanced. Manichaeism had been the state religion of the Uyghur Empire from 762 to 840 CE. Its theological texts contained descriptions of material transformation processes that Soviet researchers suspected encoded practical metallurgical or chemical knowledge. Within the collection sat pharmacological content, plant-based remedies, mineral preparations, protochemical procedures that Soviet researchers cataloged but never fully analyzed. There were also star charts and planetary observation records that don't align with either Chinese or Hellenistic astronomical traditions. They suggest an independent Central Asian observational tradition. That's a significant claim. It would mean the Silk Road wasn't just a conduit for trade, but for independent scientific observation. The Cultural Revolution devastated the field from 1966 to 76. China destroyed or sealed many Xinjiang archaeological sites, cutting off Soviet access entirely. Continuous publication of results from Chinese excavations began only in 1973. Soviet Orientalists Mikhail Freiman and Vladimir Lifshitz made significant contributions to Sogdian decipherment, but they published in Russian-language journals largely inaccessible to Western scholarship during the Cold War. Here's the critical number. An estimated 30 to 40% of Sogdian texts in the St. Petersburg collection remain unpublished and untranslated as of the 2020s. Post-Soviet budget collapses in the 1990s halted work on the turf and materials. Fragments sit in storage, awaiting conservation and digitization. The mainstream view treats the text as religious and literary documents of great philological importance, but with no hidden technical content. The astronomical and alchemical passages are theological metaphors, not empirical observations. The historical interpretation argues that Manichaean texts encode genuine observational astronomy and protochemistry within their cosmological framework. The independent star charts and pharmacological content suggest real empirical knowledge embedded in religious language. The speculative position holds that the untranslated 30 to 40% may contain the most technically significant content, including lost practical processes with modern applications, 30 to 40% unread. That is an astonishing number for a collection held by a major research institution for over a century. But incomplete knowledge wasn't limited to manuscripts. Deep in the Ural Mountains, Soviet archaeologists stumbled onto a site that would challenge everything they thought they knew about Bronze Age civilization. Number 4. The Archaeum acoustic properties. In 1987, archaeologist Gennady Zdanovich's team was sent to examine a valley slated for flooding by a reservoir project in the southern Urals. What they found was Archaeum. It changed everything about what researchers understood regarding Bronze Age steppe civilizations. The architecture was remarkable. A circular stronghold of 2 concentric bastions made of adobe with timber frames. 4 entrances oriented toward cardinal points. 60 dwellings, each containing hearths, cellars, wells, and metallurgical furnaces. A circular street paved with wood, lined by a covered drainage gutter with pits for water collection. This was sophisticated urban engineering dating to approximately 2050 to 1900 BCE. Think about what was happening elsewhere at that date. Egypt's Middle Kingdom was emerging. Minoan Crete was developing its palace complexes. And here in the Urals, nomadic adjacent peoples were building planned circular cities with integrated drainage systems. In April 1991, the Council of Ministers canceled the reservoir construction and declared Arkham a historical and geographical museum. It was one of the Soviet government's last acts before collapse. The settlement belonged to the Sintashta culture. These were Proto-Indo-Iranian speakers who developed some of the earliest known spoked-wheel chariots. Here is what most accounts leave out. Soviet acoustic engineers were brought into the interdisciplinary study team between 1988 and 1990. They documented unusual sound propagation properties within the circular wall structure. The concentric design created standing wave patterns. Sound produced in the central courtyard was amplified and focused in ways suggesting the builders understood resonance principles empirically. They didn't need to write equations describing wave behavior. They built structures that exploited it. Comparative studies with other circular Bronze Age structures, such as Mycenaean Tholos tombs and British henges, found similar acoustic properties. But Arkham's double ring design produced a more complex acoustic signature than any single ring structure studied. Each dwelling contained metallurgical furnaces capable of smelting bronze. Arkham was simultaneously residential, defensive, religious, and industrial. A combination unique for its era. K.K. Bistrushkin claimed in 2003 that Arkham's astronomical alignment offered accuracy of 1 arc minute versus Stonehenge's 10 arc minutes. That claim has not been independently verified. More than 20 other structures built on similar patterns have been found across the southern Urals to northern Kazakhstan. This is the Land of Towns network. Genetic studies of Sintashta burials show R1az93Y chromosome haplogroups. The same lineage found at high frequencies among modern Indo-Iranian speakers across South and Central Asia. These were likely the people who carried Indo-Iranian languages, chariot technology, and metallurgical knowledge southward into Iran and India. The acoustic studies were conducted by Chelyabinsk Technical Institute engineers, not archaeologists. Their findings were published in Russian-language technical reports, not archaeological journals. The mainstream position holds the acoustic properties are incidental byproducts of defensive architecture. The builders optimized for military protection, and resonance was coincidental. The archaeological theory argues the builders empirically understood and exploited acoustic resonance for ceremonial purposes, consistent with documented acoustic properties at other circular Bronze Age sites worldwide. The speculative view treats Arkham as primarily an acoustic and astronomical instrument, a sound temple whose residential and industrial functions were secondary. The acoustic engineers' reports remain unpublished in any peer-reviewed Western journal. They exist only in Russian technical literature and late Soviet conference proceedings, but the Urals weren't the only place where Soviet researchers detected physical anomalies at ancient sites. 1,500 kilometers to the southeast, in the Altai Mountains, geophysicists found something even harder to explain. Number 5, the Petersburg Mound Energy Anomalies. The Petersburg burials are Scythian-era kurgans dating to the 5th through 3rd centuries BCE in the Altai Mountains. Sergei Rudenko first excavated them in 1929, and again from 1947 to 1949. The finds were spectacular. The world's oldest known pile carpet, tattooed mummies, preserved horse sacrifices, elaborate gold work. These are among the most celebrated archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. What's far less known are the geophysical anomalies detected during later Soviet expeditions. In the 1960s, Soviet geophysicists conducting magnetometric surveys of unopened kurgans in the broader Pazyryk Valley recorded electromagnetic readings that deviated significantly from expected baselines. The anomalies were initially attributed to metallic grave goods, but signal patterns didn't match signatures expected from gold, bronze, or iron concentrations. They were more diffuse and rhythmic than metal signatures should produce. The Altai Mountains sit atop a complex tectonic zone where the Eurasian, Indian, and Mongolian plates interact. Natural geomagnetic anomalies are common. Some Soviet researchers operating within the psychotronics framework propose that Scythian shamans intentionally selected burial sites with natural geomagnetic properties. An ethnographic parallel exists. Altaic shamanic traditions still practiced by indigenous Altai peoples describe certain landscape features as having specific energy. That concept could correlate with measurable geomagnetism. The Petersburg embalming techniques deserve attention as a technical achievement on their own. Iceland's preservation created natural cryogenic conditions that preserved organic material for 2,500 years. That is empirical mastery of thermodynamic principles. The builders didn't know the term thermodynamics. They understood the process. Rudenko documented Chinese silk, Persian carpets, and goods from across Eurasia in the tombs. The Scythians controlled trade networks spanning over 5,000 kilometers, predating the formal Silk Road by 2 millennia. The Siberian ice maiden found on the Ukok Plateau in 1993 bore tattoos following lines researchers have compared to acupuncture meridians. Ritual cannabis use was confirmed by preserved seeds and inhalation apparatus found in the tombs. Researchers in the 1970s observed several kurgans positioned along geological fault lines. The electromagnetic research was discontinued after budget cuts in the early 70s. The instruments used were crude fluxgate magnetometers. Data quality was limited. The classified reports were folded into broader special department files, the same archive housing psychotronics program data. This contaminated the data's credibility. Legitimate geophysical findings became indistinguishable from paranormal research. Denisova Cave sits only approximately 150 kilometers from the Pazyryk complex. The Altai region has been a crossroads of human activity for over 300,000 years. Russian and Kazakh researchers have proposed systematic surveys of all known Altai kurgans using modern squid magnetometers. Funding has not materialized. The mainstream view attributes the anomalies entirely to the Altai's tectonic complexity. The archaeological interpretation suggests the Scythians empirically recognized geomagnetic properties of certain landscapes and incorporated them into site selection rituals. They didn't understand the physics. They recognized the sensation. The speculative position holds that the kurgans were deliberately engineered to interact with local geomagnetic fields, serving as amplification devices for a shamanic ritual. The Pazyryk data remains in Russian archives, never subjected to modern statistical analysis or published in any Western scientific journal, but the Altai wasn't the only place the Soviets sent classified teams to investigate ancient sites. 2,000 kilometers to the south in the mountains of Central Asia, a lake held secrets the KGB itself went looking for. Number 6. The Issyk-Kul Repository. Lake Issyk-Kul is the 8th deepest lake in the world. It sits at 1,607 meters elevation in the Tian Shan Mountains, 182 kilometers long up to 60 kilometers wide. It rarely freezes despite its altitude due to high salinity. The medieval evidence is striking. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced by cartographer Abraham Cresques, depicts a building on the shore with an inscription identifying a monastery of Armenian brothers said to contain the remains of Apostle Matthew. A 1450 map by Estense of Ferrara independently references the same monastery. 2 independent medieval European cartographic sources confirming the tradition. In 1952, the Ministry of State Security started treasure searches at the lake in strict confidence. This was a KGB operation, not an academic expedition. Between 1968 and 75, Kyrgyz General A. Aliyev officially addressed the Soviet Ministry, Committee of State Security, and Academy of Sciences proposing to continue the treasure search. On August 27, 1975, Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, publicly reported the Ministry of Internal Affairs was searching for Genghis Khan's treasures at Issyk-Kul. Unusual transparency for a classified operation. Between 1985 and 1989, underwater researchers discovered historically valuable objects up to 2,500 years old. They found 9 medieval and 3 ancient settlements on the lake bottom. The motivations were layered. Gold and treasure recovery for state coffers, intelligence on Silk Road trade routes, and the politically sensitive question of Christian relics on Soviet territory under official state atheism. A golden hammer, found by treasure hunters in 1930, was handed to the State Gold Procurement Office in Przhevalsk and officially registered. The treasure hunters were then forbidden to continue. A military complication made everything harder. The Soviet Navy operated a submarine and torpedo testing facility at the lake's east end. The entire area was a restricted military zone. Civilian archaeological access was severely limited. Arab chronicles describe wealthy Silk Road settlements along the shores, including Barskan, a hub where metalworkers developed alloy techniques previously known only in China. The lake sits in a zone of high seismic activity. Earthquakes over centuries submerged entire settlements, creating an underwater archaeological preserve potentially rivaling Mediterranean sites. A 2002 American expedition claimed discovery of an ancient Nestorian monastery and an artifact that researchers suggested might contain the remains of St. Matthew. Professor Vladimir Ploskik's systematic underwater work from the 1980s onward recovered bronze crosses, medieval ceramics with Christian symbols, and large candle holders from the lake bed. Radiocarbon dating showed a flooded settlement at the lake bottom had existed for over 3,000 years of continuous habitation. The Soviet Navy's detailed bathymetric maps of the entire lake exist in Russian Navy archives. They could guide archaeological expeditions but have never been released for civilian use. The mainstream view treats the ruins as typical Silk Road settlements submerged by tectonic activity. The monastery tradition is a medieval legend. The historical interpretation notes that Nestorian Christianity's eastward expansion through Persia, India, and China is well documented. A substantial monastery at this Silk Road nexus is entirely plausible. The speculative position holds the lake contains a deliberately hidden repository of relics and manuscripts that would make Issyk-Kul one of the most significant Christian pilgrimage sites in the world. Confirmation would rewrite the history of early Christian expansion. It would demonstrate Nestorian Christianity reached far deeper into Central Asia than commonly acknowledged. That question remains open. But it wasn't only religious mysteries the Soviets found in their vast territory. In the Altai Mountains, decades before anyone extracted ancient DNA, Soviet archaeologists found tools that didn't belong to any known species. Number 7. The Denisova Cave Pre-Human Toolkit. In the 1970s, Soviet paleontologist Nikolai Ovodov first inspected Denisova Cave looking for conid remains. In 1977, he identified the site's archaeological heritage. Exploratory excavations revealed materials spanning the Paleolithic to the Middle Ages. The cave's stratigraphic record is extraordinary. Over 22 layers spanning approximately 300,000 years of continuous or intermittent hominin occupation, one of the longest occupation sequences in northern Asia. In 1982, the Institute of History, Philology, and Philosophy of the Siberian branch of the Academy of Sciences began complex research under academician A.P. Derivienko. What his teams found in the middle layers didn't make sense. Stone tool assemblages that didn't conform to established Mousterian typologies associated with Neanderthals or Upper Paleolithic typologies associated with modern humans. Blade technologies appeared in layers dated far earlier than they should have. Manufacturing techniques combined elements of multiple known traditions in ways without precedent. Soviet reports from the 1980s proposed a parallel technological lineage. The possibility that an unknown Haymanin population had independently developed sophisticated tool-making. This was explosive. Soviet archaeology was already invested in the multi-regional model of human evolution. Evidence of a distinct hominin lineage in Siberia would support the idea of multiple simultaneous evolutionary centers. But without genetic analysis, which wouldn't be available for decades, tool anomalies couldn't be attributed to a specific population. The findings were considered too speculative for formal publication. The vindication came in 2008 with the discovery of a finger bone. By 2010, it was conclusively established as belonging to a separate human species, the Denisova hominin. What Soviet-era researchers had suspected from tools alone was confirmed by DNA. The artifacts from the cave are remarkable in their own right. A bone needle dated to 50,000 years ago, described as the most ancient known. A chlortolite bracelet. A marble ring. An ivory ring. Bone tools from layers dated 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. These ornamental objects challenged assumptions about archaic hominins. These were not the cognitively limited beings mainstream science had assumed. A girl nicknamed Denny turned out to have a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. The interbreeding that the mixed tool traditions had implicitly suggested was genetically confirmed. Denisova Cave is the only confirmed site where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans all occupied the same location at different times. Approximately 4 to 6% of modern Melanesian DNA derives from Denisovans. These archaic humans range far beyond the Altai. The mainstream 1980s view held that the anomalous tools resulted from stratigraphic mixing or misclassification. The Soviet internal theory of a parallel technological lineage was essentially correct, as the 2010 Denisovan discovery confirmed. The speculative modern extension asks whether Denisovan cognitive capacities, including art, needlemaking, jewelry, and possibly language, were fully on par with modern humans. The unpublished Soviet-era tool analyses remain in the archives of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk. They represent a pre-genetic record of anomalies that DNA later explained. Soviet archaeologists working with mid-20th century technology had detected what 21st century genetics would confirm, and the Altai region that produced both Denisova Cave and the Petersburg burials also produced something else. A metallurgical revolution that reshaped the entire Eurasian continent in barely 3 centuries. Number 8. The Seima-Turbino metallurgical enigma. The central puzzle is speed. The Seima-Turbino phenomenon involved the rapid and widespread dissemination of specific tin-bronze artifacts from Fennoscandia to Mongolia, approximately 2200 to 1900 BCE, over 8,000 kilometers in roughly 300 years. There is no consensus on how this was possible. Burial sites with similar bronze artifacts are attested across northern Eurasia, Siberia, Central Asia, Fennoscandia, Mongolia, northeast China, the Russian Far East, Korea, and Japan. The homeland was the Altai Mountains, the same region as Petersburg and Denisova Cave. These were nomadic warriors and metal workers traveling on horseback or two-wheeled carts. The metallurgical revolution is the core of the mystery. Seima-Turbino weapons contain tin-bronze ore from the Sayan and Altai Mountains. Prior metallurgy relied on copper or arsenical bronze. Tin bronze was harder, more durable, and more reliable. In modern terms, think of the transition from wrought iron to steel. The advantage was immediately obvious to anyone who tested it. The techniques included lost wax casting with high artistic input, technology entirely unknown to the regions where it suddenly appeared. These bronzes achieved hardness superior to contemporaneous Mediterranean bronzes. That finding is uncomfortable for narratives placing metallurgical primacy in the Near East. E. N. Chernik, the leading Soviet archaeometallurgist, spent decades mapping what he called the Eurasian metallurgical province. His work demonstrated that Seima-Turbino represented a revolution that reshuffled power dynamics across the continent. The Seima cemetery near the Oka-Volga confluence was first excavated around 1914. The Turbino cemetery in Perm was excavated in 1924. What baffled Soviet metallurgists in the 1960s and 70s was the transmission speed. The artifacts appeared across 8,000 kilometers faster than any known migration or trade model could account for. Neither horse-based travel nor trade network diffusion explained the pace. The Kenotaph mystery deepens the puzzle. Most Seima-Turbino burial sites contain empty graves rather than actual burials. Artifact deposits were ritual offerings, not practical grave goods. Groundbreaking genetic studies published in 2024 analyzing Seima-Turbino associated burials at Rostovka revealed extraordinarily diverse ancestry. Western Steppe herder, Eastern Siberian, and Okinawa components. No single genetic signature. This was not one people. It was a multi-ethnic phenomenon. Socketed spearheads with single side hooks appeared during the Taosi culture period in China around 2100 to 2000 BCE. This suggests Chinese bronze metallurgy may initially have derived from steppe cultures. After 1900 BCE, the phenomenon ceased as a distinct entity, but the metalworking style continued to radiate, with objects based on Seima-Turbino traditions eventually reaching from Fennoscandia to Southeast Asia. The mainstream interpretation holds that tin bronze's obvious superiority created rapid adoption through commercial exchange. The archaeological theory proposes a migrating elite warrior-smith caste carrying techniques across the continent. The genetic diversity would result from absorbing local populations along the way. The speculative view suggests something more organized. A deliberate network-based dissemination by a metallurgical guild or ritual brotherhood operating across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. A prehistoric franchise system. How did a metallurgical tradition spread so far, so fast, among such genetically diverse populations? That question connects metallurgy, migration, genetics, and ritual practice into a single unsolved problem. And it was not the only time Soviet researchers encountered ancient practices in the far north that defied easy explanation. Number 9. the Kola Peninsula Pre-Sámi civilization. In 1921, the Soviet government sent researcher Alexander Barchenko to the Kola Peninsula within the Arctic Circle. The official mission was to investigate mysterious outbreaks of mass hysteria among the Sami people. That was the cover story, but not the full picture. Barchenko had been elected head of a scientific expedition to the Russian north on January 30th, 1920, by the Academic Commission of Academician Bekhterev's Brain Institute. A legitimate scientific institution, the official target was Menerik, a collective trance state unique to Arctic peoples, sometimes called Arctic hysteria, or the call of the North Star. This is a genuine and documented phenomenon. What Barchenko claimed to find went much further. He described the peninsula as littered with mysterious pyramids and toppled stone columns, ancient roads meandering through the landscape, towering stone figures carved into hillsides. At Side Lake, he reported remains of colossal sacred images, prehistoric clearings, and half-collapsed underground passages. His team repeatedly found fragments of a stone road that seemed to start and end nowhere. Compass readings showed it was oriented according to cardinal directions. The real Soviet interest was pragmatic despite the mystical overtones. The early Soviet state wanted any technology or technique providing military or intelligence advantages, including telepathy, mass psychological manipulation, and ancient knowledge encoding exploitable phenomena. On December 31st, 1924, top-ranking officials of the OGPU secret police gathered in Moscow to hear Barchenko speak. They were led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, Lenin's feared security chief. Barchenko outlined what he described as spiritual powers possessed by Tibetan sages. The collaboration deepened. Barchenko helped select employees with alleged superpowers for the cryptographic department headed by Gleb Boki, head of the OGPU's special department responsible for codes and ciphers. Boki believed ancient knowledge systems could provide breakthroughs in cryptographic security or offensive psychological operations. Barchenko's expedition was contemporaneous with Nicholas Rorik's Central Asian expeditions of 1925 through 1928, partly funded by Soviet intelligence and seeking the mythical kingdom of Shambhala. In 1937, everything was destroyed. Both Boki and Barchenko were arrested as part of Stalin's Great Purge. Boki confessed under torture. Both were shot. Several surviving expedition members were killed alongside them. According to one account, the extensive material Barchenko collected is stored in Russian intelligence archives and remains a state secret. The geological skepticism is reasonable. Conventional geologists who later examined the Kola megaliths attributed many of Barchenko's pyramids to natural weathering of granite formations. But the ethnographic authenticity is undeniable. Sami veneration of specific stone formations and alignment rituals are genuine practices suggesting deep time relationships between indigenous peoples and the landscape. Valery Demin's Hyperborea 97 expedition revisited Barchenko's sites and claimed to find ruins of defensive structures and an observatory on Mount Ninchurt. But the inclusion of psychics and ufologists undermined scientific credibility. The Kola Superdeep borehole, drilled on the same peninsula from 1970 to 1994, reached 12,262 meters, the deepest artificial point on Earth. Kola was simultaneously the site of the USSR's most ambitious geological project and its most eccentric archaeological one. The mainstream position attributes Barchenko's findings to natural granite weathering patterns. The ethnographic interpretation holds that while the megalithic claims are exaggerated, the Sami cultural practices he documented are genuine phenomena, reflecting thousands of years of indigenous landscape interaction. The speculative view maintains the Kola Peninsula contains remnants of a pre-Sámi civilization, and the Soviet state's intense interest from Barchenko through to the intelligence agencies suggests they found something worth classifying. Stalin's Great Purge killed Soviet occult research for 2 decades. It didn't restart until after Stalin's death in 1953. But the obsession with finding lost knowledge in Russian soil didn't end with remote Arctic sites. The most famous search of all was happening directly beneath the Kremlin itself. Number 10. The Library of Ivan the Terrible. The legend begins with a dowry. Sophia Palaiologina, member of the last Byzantine imperial dynasty, married Ivan III in 1472. When Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, the surviving library was smuggled westward. It reportedly contained works by Virgil, Suetonius, Aristophanes, Polybius, Pindar, Tacitus, Livius, and Cicero. Some 800 manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. 19th century historian Christopher von Dabeloff published a claim that the list included 142 volumes of Titus Livius's History of Rome. Historians currently know only 35, a full version of Cicero's De Re Publici, an unknown poem by Virgil. If real, any single one of these would constitute a landmark manuscript discovery. The physical evidence is tantalizing. A 1724 report describes V. Makariev's 1682 discovery. Ordered into a Kremlin secret passage, he found a room full of trunks. But Princess Sophia Alexeyevna forbade anyone to access those rooms. Ignatius Tiletsky, an early 20th century archaeologist, spent his life searching for the library. In 1933, he delivered a memo directly to Stalin and secured permission to excavate under the Kremlin. Work began under the Arsenalnaya Towers, but was discontinued in 1934 after the assassination of Sergei Kirov. Stalin's motivations were multiple. The new Soviet government initially sold Tsarist treasures abroad for foreign currency. The library's material wealth was one draw. Possession of lost classical texts would be an enormous cultural prestige project, and Stalin personally identified with Ivan the Terrible, seeing himself as a successor. The metro construction presented an opportunity. Stalin wished to create one of the world's greatest subway systems. All excavations were executed with special care in hopes of uncovering secret rooms. Several underground chambers and tunnels were discovered. All were found empty. Khrushchev continued the pursuit in the 1960s, instructing subway project managers to take all necessary steps to locate the library. The Kremlin's subterranean complexity is extraordinary. Italian architect Aristotle Fioravanti built hidden vaults in the 15th century. Subsequent rulers added tunnels, bunkers, and passages over 5 centuries. A 1944 article in the newspaper Trude reported 5 books in vintage leather bindings from Ivan the Terrible's personal collection held in the USSR State Library. At least fragments survived. A figure named Apollos, who examined the Kremlin underground in the 1930s, reportedly found an ancient passage to a hiding place. The discovery nearly cost him his life and was kept secret for decades. Peter the Great searched. Napoleon searched during his 1812 occupation. Every Soviet leader from Lenin to Gorbachev authorized some form of search. The metro paradox is striking. One of the largest underground engineering projects in history revealed passages but simultaneously destroyed potential archaeological contexts. The mainstream view holds the library was dispersed, sold, or destroyed centuries ago. The historical interpretation argues the Kremlin's subterranean network is so vast that previous searches covered only a fraction. Fioravanti's documented hidden vaults were specifically designed to be unfindable. The speculative position suggests the library was found during Soviet construction and quietly absorbed into classified state collections. The Russian government possesses the manuscripts but has never disclosed them. Alexander Wexler's observation captures the cultural weight perfectly. The library has become a Russian touchstone comparable to the Ark of the Covenant in Western lore. Every century since the 15th has produced searchers. Each with new technology and new authority, the library remains unfound, or at least unrevealed. 10 cases spanning 300,000 years of human activity, from Mesolithic geoglyphs to Byzantine manuscripts. The pattern across them is structural, not conspiratorial. Discoveries fell into institutional gaps between military, intelligence, and civilian academic systems. Each system had different classification protocols, publication norms, and funding streams. Soviet-era document classification used at least 5 levels of secrecy. Material classified at one level could not be referenced in publications at a lower level. The Vashka photographs, Pazyryk electromagnetic data, Issyk-Kul bathymetric maps, and Anand-Urbe files all entered military or intelligence archives rather than academic ones. The same structural failure repeated across decades and disciplines. Interdisciplinary research was structurally discouraged. Acoustic engineers studying Archaeum couldn't publish in archaeological journals. Archaeologists at Denisova couldn't access genetic laboratories. The psychotronics program made things worse by absorbing legitimate geophysical and archaeological data into classified paranormal research files. Anything associated with psychotronics became unpublishable. The Great Purge destroyed the Kola research network entirely. Not institutional neglect, active destruction. The post-Soviet collapse created a second wave of loss. The 1990s budget crisis halted work on Turfan manuscripts, Petersburg surveys, Archaeum acoustics, and Issyk-Kul underwater archaeology simultaneously. Russian archives remain among the most restricted in the world. The dispersal of the Soviet Union across 15 successor states further complicated access. Kyrgyzstan's Issyk-Kul data, Kazakhstan's Turgay geoglyph surveys, and Russia's central archives are now governed by different national systems. No equivalent of the American Freedom of Information Act exists in Russia. The pattern is not conspiracy. It's bureaucratic entropy. Each individual decision to classify, to fund, to prioritize extraction over archaeology was locally rational. Collectively, it was catastrophic for knowledge preservation. But here's the counter-argument. Every unresolved question in these 10 cases could be addressed with technologies already in routine use elsewhere. Airborne LiDAR can penetrate forest canopy and detect surface features at centimeter resolution. It revealed Maya cities in Guatemala. It could distinguish natural periglacial patterning from human-made geoglyphs in the Vashka basin. Boreal forest is dense but not tropical. The technology's pulse penetration is well suited to coniferous canopy. Satellite multispectral imaging using freely available Sentinel-2 data could comprehensively map Archaeum's 20-plus sister settlements. Squid magnetometers, orders of magnitude more sensitive than 1960s fluxgate instruments, could definitively characterize the Petersburg electromagnetic anomalies. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with side-scan sonar could map Issyk-Kul's 6,236 square kilometer lakebed in months. Ground-penetrating radar could map the Kremlin's subsurface to 30-plus meters without excavation. Machine learning models trained on known Sogdian texts could accelerate translation of the untranslated Turfan fragments. Modern computational acoustic simulation could model Archaeum's double-ring structure digitally without needing site access. The Turgay geoglyphs prove the concept. They were discovered by an amateur researcher using Google Earth and confirmed by professional archaeologists. Satellite archaeology can be done at near zero cost. A comprehensive LiDAR survey of the Vashka Basin would cost less than a single season of traditional excavation. The Denisova cave case demonstrates what happens when modern technology meets Soviet-era data. Tool anomalies documented in the 1980s were explained by DNA analysis in 2010. Archived observations gained new meaning when new methods arrived. And despite everything, the Soviets got a great deal right. The standard narrative treats Soviet archaeology as hopelessly ideological. But across these cases, Soviet researchers were often directionally correct even when their frameworks were flawed. The parallel technological lineage hypothesis at Denisova was dismissed as speculative in the 1980s. The Denisovan discovery in 2010 proved the core intuition correct. Chernyk's Eurasian metallurgical province concept, developed over decades of Soviet-era work, is now the standard framework for understanding Bronze Age technology transfer. Soviet Orientalists' Sogdian decipherment, published in inaccessible Russian journals, is recognized as foundational to Central Asian linguistics. The Archaeum acoustic measurements align with independently conducted studies at other circular Bronze Age sites worldwide. Ideological pressure sometimes had a paradoxical benefit. The requirement to frame all findings in materialist terms forced Soviet researchers to seek physical explanations for phenomena Western researchers might have dismissed as ritual or symbolic. Archaeum's acoustics and Petersburg's geomagnetism were investigated precisely because the Soviet framework demanded material mechanisms. The Marxist materialist approach to the Onanurba documents, stripping away racial pseudoscience and looking for exploitable physical phenomena, was actually more rational than either the Nazi mysticism that produced the documents or the American CIA's more credulous approach in MKUltra. The principal failure was not in data collection but in data dissemination. The science was often good. The publication and sharing mechanisms were broken. Soviet archaeological fieldwork was meticulous in recording. Stratigraphic documentation, field drawings, and cataloging practices met international standards. The interpretive frameworks were constrained. The observations were sound. The greatest contribution may be the datasets themselves. Field notes, survey photographs, geophysical measurements, tool catalogs. All becoming more valuable as analytical technology improves. This raises questions that go beyond any single case. Does a state have the right to classify archaeological discoveries that belong to human heritage? At least 5 of these 10 cases involve data currently held in classified military or intelligence archives. Classified archaeology is a unique form of knowledge destruction. The data exists, it is preserved, but its inaccessibility makes it functionally equivalent to loss. The declassified Corona spy satellite photographs released in 1995 revealed thousands of previously unknown archaeological sites across the Middle East. They prove that military imagery can be declassified after its intelligence value expires. The Turfan manuscripts raise a different question. 30 to 40% untranslated, not classified. Simply unfunded. Knowledge loss through neglect is as real as knowledge loss through classification. The Denisovan DNA findings represent the ideal outcome. Genetic data from the cave has been shared internationally and transformed our understanding of human evolution. The contrast between Denisova, open and internationally collaborative, and Petersburg, classified and inaccessible, demonstrates that the choice between knowledge sharing and knowledge hoarding is institutional, not inevitable. Digital technology offers a potential bypass. High-resolution satellite imagery, open-source geophysical tools, and international DNA databases can generate new data independently of restricted archives. Citizen science and open-access archaeology have democratized the field in ways Soviet institutional structures never anticipated. Across 300,000 years of activity at Denisova Cave, 4,200 years since Arkham's construction, and 2,500 years since the Petersburg burials, human cultures repeatedly discovered the same physical principles through direct observation. Arkham's standing wave patterns, Petersburg's cryogenic preservation, Seima-Turbino's tin-bronze alloys, acoustic resonance, thermodynamics, materials science, fundamental laws of nature exploited without formal theory, the Sogdian pharmacological texts, the Scythian site selection practices, the Mesolithic geoglyph builders, observation-based knowledge systems achieving remarkable sophistication without modern scientific frameworks. Every culture in these 10 cases, from unknown Mesolithic builders to Sintashta bronzesmiths to Scythian shamans to Sogdian merchants, worked with the same gravitational constants, the same electromagnetic spectrum, the same material properties that modern science describes. What the Soviets were searching for, across all 10 cases, was ultimately the same thing. Evidence that deep human ingenuity is not modern, not Western, and not accidental. It is a fundamental expression of what our species does when it encounters the physical world. The secrets aren't truly lost. They're waiting in archives, at the bottom of lakes, beneath permafrost, and in untranslated manuscripts, for the next generation of investigators willing to look. The questions remain, and they are answerable.